Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in here. Mostly to say hello. We're about halfway through the 16-week term now, so halfway through our course. As I'm recording this and posting it, we are right between that first due date and second for our creative nonfiction unit. So people have submitted work now within their groups, and now we have that opportunity to provide some feedback. So I wanted to make a couple of comments about the feedback part of it, but also just an initial comment about how interesting I found so many of the creative nonfiction pieces. And I think what many people discovered is, as I'd mentioned earlier, it's kind of an odd genre. It's one that is really familiar to us or recognizable, and I think accessible for people to write in because it is so personal. But it's hard to separate it from just kind of like a diary entry or a very personal kind of writing versus true fiction where you're making predominantly like most of the things up. And then I think one thing that I didn't mention that I think a few people maybe discovered or backed into a little bit is how much overlap there is between something like a personal essay and creative nonfiction. And again, the more you think about it, sometimes the more overlap or the more gray area there really is. And honestly, I think what I would call more of the personal essay style of writing that people turned in was quite effective. So it's not really to gainsay the work that people have done, but maybe just to have us reflecting on how different genres operate differently, and even how, maybe at the end of the day, how artificial some of those labels really are. They're like convenient for organizing our course, but do they serve any other kind of purpose? Maybe they do in terms of us being writers and thinking about how we tell particular stories, but in other ways they just get in the way of being creative. So for me, the personal essay it doesn't really tell a story. It has qualities of an essay, like a composition. So there's an introduction, there's a body, and there's a conclusion. But it doesn't necessarily subscribe to the basic theory of the short story that we've looked at in earlier units, where you have, a rising action, some sort of climactic moment, and then falling action. And whether it's that perfect sort of pyramid where the climactic action is like right in the middle, that is very rare. In fact, sometimes it can be shifted towards the front, sometimes it happens right near the end, or practically it is the end. And so when you think about creative nonfiction, you want to think about, does your piece have that sense of storytelling, of rising action, of this kind of moment, and then falling action? Or is it more like a personal essay where you have not so much a narrative or a story or series of events that you're talking about, but really a kind of theme or topic that you want to address, but it's one that happens to be personal to you. That's what makes it that's the personal part of the personal essay. And again, I'm not suggesting that this affects your grade at all, and although it may shape the feedback that you get from people, but I think it is useful to think about like what sort of rules apply to what genres, or what the aim of a particular genre is, even if all this does is get you a little bit more conscious, for future writing. If you have an idea, you want to be kind of intentional about what genre you're going to use to communicate that idea. Does it need to be a work of complete fiction, almost like sci-fi fantasy? Does it need to be a creative nonfiction like we've experimented with here? Is it more of a personal essay? Would something like poetry really fit better for what you're interested in? So again, the genres can be a little artificial or limiting in certain kinds of ways, but I think they can also be beneficial, or they can help us to ask good questions. Having said that, though, let's talk much more practically about where we're at in our course now. So we've had the workshop experience. We're now right in the middle of this current one. People have submitted their work. So I want you to, if nothing else, just recognize that due date-wise, we have basically a whole week now between the submission date and when you're returning feedback. So if you were in a face-to-face 3-credit class, that week would involve 3 class meetings. So that's 3 50-minute sessions, right? Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And that's just class time. That doesn't include like homework or other projects you might work on. So as you're doing feedback on the pieces that you've got here, be really conscious to invest some meaningful time. So, 10 minutes of reading a story and throwing some comments in there, that just doesn't cut it. That's not enough time that you've invested. Again, if you were to think of it just as a face-to-face class, you have like 3 hours of just seat time. So the nice thing for us, though, isn't that we can reduce the time we spend on task, but we can portion it out more flexibly. So if 5 a.m. is the time that you happen to have free, you can invest an hour. If 6 p.m. happens to work for you, or 5 a.m. one day and 6 p.m. the next day. So it's flexible that way, but it doesn't mean that we have this week, you have this work to do in front of you, and you just invest like 15 or 20 minutes and call it a day. That's really not enough. And so I obviously can't track realistically how much time you invest. All I can see is the file that you send back, and so I can kind of extrapolate from that and guesstimate about how much time you've invested. So obviously I look at the sheer quantity of feedback you've provided. Does it suggest that you've really worked with that manuscript, or does it suggest that you've skimmed through once and provided a couple of comments here and there and one sort of paragraph at the bottom, which is useful, but it clearly doesn't suggest a real investment on your part as a reader. And of course, the nice thing about Workshop is that the golden rule. So you want to get that really meaningful feedback from your group members, and so one of the ways to help make that happen is to provide really meaningful feedback. So if you're not really given great feedback, you can't expect to be getting it in return. And so again, when you do the feedback part, you can do so many different things, and you don't have to pick just one of these, or they're not mutually exclusive. You can edit for basic typos. That's helpful, but of course you wouldn't want to stop there. You can talk about the work as it affects you just as a reader, not as a professor of writing or any kind of expert, just like how you reacted, positively, negatively. Did it seem to get bogged down? You kind of had to like grind your way through. Was it really, really intense all the way through? And that doesn't even have to be like a kind of value judgment, or I was like interested enough to give this a B here and a C there, but it was an A by the end. You don't have to grade it that way. You can just provide that sort of readerly feedback and make it specific. So the thing that maybe is time consuming, and you've been given time to do this, is not just to say, I was really interested, or I thought the pacing here got a little bit slow. Try to give a for example. Like, it was really exciting because of the way you manage the paragraphs. Something as simple as that, right? Is it all one big block of a paragraph, which can really, even if it's interesting events, we just sort of get bogged down in that big chunk of text? Or has the writer used paragraphs effectively to move quickly between scenes or moments or actions? Or is description really effective? So not just, you described this really well, I could picture myself there. That's great to say, but was it the particular word choices? Was it lots of description? Or was it, hopefully, more judicious description, but the things that the writer chose to describe were really evocative? So it's not a description of every tree in the forest. It's a description of a couple that really evoke that atmosphere or that sense. So that's another kind of commentary you can provide on the work. And again, it's not the only kind, but it works in tandem with that more typo editing. And then the other kind is maybe more trying to embrace the role of a critical reader, reading through the lens of the rules of creative writing that we've talked about, the various examples that I had you look at for our creative nonfiction piece here. So I get that you might feel uncomfortable trying to be a professor of writing or any kind of expert, but you sort of do have to take on that role a little bit to reflect back to your writer the things that we've been covering in class. So imagine that we were in a sort of class where we just learned a bunch of facts, like dates that things happened. And we did a test where I asked you a bunch of questions. What happened on this date? Who died on this date? What battle took place? And you just filled in answers that were factually right or wrong. if you exchange that paper with somebody in a sort of pre-grading exercise, you wouldn't necessarily have to be a Civil War history professor to notice that a couple of the dates were just factually wrong, right? So you would correct those, not because you're an expert in the field, but because you recognize that what you learned in the course isn't being reflected in the test, in the assessment side of things. And so, of course, our situation isn't quite so cut and dry, but you still do have to think in terms of, okay, for part of what I'm doing for the commentary is I'm acting as a sort of reflector of things that we have learned in the course, and now you're trying to apply those ideas to this particular piece of writing. Does it have that narrative arc where there's rising action and a sort of climactic moment and then that falling action? Does it develop characters specifically? Does it use language in an interesting way? So that again is that element of creative nonfiction where you're not just reporting events that happened, even if they are intrinsically kind of dramatic events like a death, the end of a relationship, a birth, all of that kind of stuff. Those are interesting, but only so far. We need to be interested because we're interested in the characters involved, because they're described or developed fully. There needs to be interesting, again, use of language, sentence construction, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not asking you to be a professor or to assign a grade, but I am asking you to invest enough time where you're maybe editing, maybe providing your own kind of readerly input, like that more subjective side of things, but you're also making a conscious effort to reflect some of the ideas, the facts, quote unquote, that we've learned in our course, and are they appearing in the piece of writing that you're looking at? So again, please make that good investment of time, and this is why, again, you can see how the course is really built on these workshops as kind of the core of what we do, and then your grade is largely being simply, did you post your stuff on time, but then what was the quality of the feedback that you gave? Not so I don't grade based on the quality of your work per se, and that's it. That would be kind of no fair to you, but also really difficult for me on my end. What I can do is to really encourage and maybe teach people to give really helpful and useful and actionable feedback, so that you then in a group are getting that back maybe 4, maybe 5 times over from the various people. So instead of just my comments and my grade, you're getting a much broader sense of what a series of readers might think about your work, what's strong and also what might need some attention. Okay? So long story short, we have a week turnaround before you're providing that feedback to people. So really make sure that your feedback reflects an investment of time. And if you want to get really, again, simplistic about it, in a face-to-face course, you'd be in that class for 3 hours or like 3 50-minute blocks. So again, that's the amount of time, really at a minimum, that you should be investing in reading the work from your group and providing some really meaningful feedback. Okay, so as always, if you have questions or concerns, be in touch with me, and I will talk to everybody soon. And I think it's like 50 degrees outside, so isn't everybody happier all of a sudden?